The topic of my talk is bias preservation in machine learning, the legality of fairness metrics and the non-discrimination law. Yes, this is my latest work that I have published with two of my co-authors, Brent Mittelstaedt and Chris Russell. And I'm actually quite glad that the idea and the importance of interdisciplinary work was just mentioned, because that's exactly where my heart lies as well. I'm a lawyer by background. Brent Mittelstaedt is an ethicist, and Chris Russell is a machine learning expert, and we have worked together in the past when it came to explainability issues, and now we try to tackle fairness together. So this is our latest work that I'm very excited to present to you today. Roughly, this is the overview and the plan that I will follow during my presentation. I will have a section that talks a little bit about what fairness actually means in legal terms. Then I will move over and talk about what fairness actually means in computer science. And the third section will show how those two notions actually collapse and clash. But to start off, I think it might be actually nice if I tell you the findings of the paper first and then show you how I actually arrived at my conclusion. So what I believe is that we're currently standing at a very important crossroad when it comes to AI fairness and bias issues. I think we have three options available in front of us, and we have to be very careful which path we're choosing. The first option is we can just don't do anything and just deploy algorithms in the world and look how they exacerbate current inequalities further. The second option is that we actually acknowledge that there is problems when it comes to AI bias, and then try to fix the technology around that, trying to make sure that things are not getting worse, keeping the status quo. And the third option is we could actually see technology as a tool that enables us to detect where inequalities lie and try to use that as a starting point to bring about social change and actually start to fix society. So those are the three options that we have ahead of us: making things worse, keeping things as they are, and trying to make things better. So when I talk about bias in AI, I think it might actually be helpful to first explain what I mean by that. When I talk about bias, I roughly can see two types of biases. This distinction is very much inspired by Nissenbaum, where you can roughly distinguish between technical bias and societal bias. So technical bias means that the problem that you're facing stems from the technology itself. Facial recognition software, for example, is one of the well-known examples of that. Facial recognition software works less accurate on female faces and faces from people of color. This is mainly the reason because the technology was trained on predominantly white male pictures, and therefore the algorithm is more familiar with that type and therefore is less accurate for anybody who doesn't fall into this realm. So you see the technology has some sort of problem that then translates into the real world and there has an impact. On the other hand, you can have societal bias. Societal bias is when the trouble that you're facing actually stems from the human that is making the decision. And the decision that they're making and the data that they're generating have their own biases in it, and is then being fed into the algorithm and then applied to human decision making, and then finds its way in our world and therefore causes problems there. Of course, this distinction is not very clean because one obviously informs the other. There's a reason why the design choice was chosen to only use or predominantly use white male faces to train facial recognition software. So it's not a clear-cut distinction, but I think it's still very helpful because it shows you what kind of goals people have taken upon themselves to fix. Are they trying to fix technology? Or are they trying to find ways to fix society? So with that, the question is, what is it that the law actually wants to do? What does fairness actually means in legal terms? So it will come as no surprise that law is actually about fixing society. But what does fairness actually means in legal term? What does it mean? And yes, everybody will probably be familiar with the idea that everybody is equal under the law. Sorry, which just goes back to Aristotle, who said we ought to treat like cases alike and unlike cases differently. Nobody will disagree with that. But the question is, what do we actually mean by equal treatment? And to show this typical conundrum, I actually want to talk about a very personal story that helped me to visualize that as myself. I must have been around 6 or 7 years old when we read a short story in school, which was called The Wise Judge. So The Wise Judge, the story centers around two siblings, a brother and a sister, who are fighting over a cake. And they cannot decide how to cut the cake up evenly. And because they couldn't find a solution, they actually seek the wisdom of a judge. And the judge, in its infinite wisdom, comes up and says, well, we're gonna make the brother cut the cake first, and the sister gets to choose the first piece. And I remember reading that story when I was a child, and I thought, that's very elegant. That's perfect. That is flawless. How amazing of a bulletproof idea to make sure that everybody gets an equal share of a cake. And I think back then I realized if a discipline is able to create something so beautiful and so bulletproof and so elegant and fair, I want to be part of it. And I think most people will agree that it is a very elegant way of figuring out, or making sure that everybody gets an equal share. But what if I told you that the sister hasn't eaten in 3 weeks? Would you still think that this method of dividing up the cake is fair and actually serves justice? You might not. And that's exactly where the conundrum comes from. And that's the conundrum that non-discrimination law deals with. We have roughly 2 types of concepts in non-discrimination law. One is called formal equality. The other one is called substantive or de facto equality. So formal equality means I'm trying to treat everybody equal. I'm trying to close my eyes, not look at the individual, and try to make sure that everybody gets an equal-sized piece of cake. Substantive equality, on the other hand, tries not to close the eyes to the differences between groups. It actually wants to take into consideration that some people are more hungry than others and try to take it into consideration when they actually making decision of dividing up resources. And this can be seen in either equal opportunity or, for example, inequality of results. So this is actually how the law tries to deal with that, acknowledging that there are 2 different ways of thinking about fairness. And those 2 concepts actually found their way into the law itself. We have, for example, prohibitions against direct discrimination and indirect discrimination. You have direct discrimination, which means you treating somebody less favorably because of protected attribute that they possess. So you're treating somebody less favorably because of their ethnicity, their gender, their sexual orientation, their ability. In most cases, this will be illegal. This goes back to Aristotle and the idea of formal equality. Everybody ought to receive the same treatment. On the other hand, you have indirect discrimination. So indirect discrimination, which is more akin to substantive equality, means that if a seemingly neutral provision, criterion, or practice is applied to everybody equally, and it just so happens that it poses a particular disadvantage on a particular protected group when compared with others in a similar situation, then this gives rise to the idea of indirect discrimination needs to be justified. So what does that mean roughly? So for example, if I'm an employer and I decide to only hire people that are taller than 2 meters, then height is obviously not a protected attribute. It's a neutral provision that is applied to everybody equally. But you will immediately understand that a height requirement could be disadvantaging at least women when making those decisions. And that is exactly what indirect discrimination prohibitions are supposed to be doing. They're actually created as a detecting mechanism, as a tool that diagnoses discrimination. It is something that is supposed to draw your attention to the social hurdles and struggles and factual differences between the groups, so you can use it as a starting point to dismantle the underlying power structures and unfairness in society. So it's actually designed to show you where more social engineering needs to be done. The underlying assumption is that everybody is equal. And if the outcome isn't equal across groups, then there is something wrong with your system, not the people. And therefore, you need to figure out why inequality has occurred, and you have to try to contravene it. If it actually happens that there is unfair outcome between certain groups, then it gives rise to prima facie discrimination, which means that you then need to justify it, give an account for why this is actually happening. So those are the two ideas. It's very clear from what we've seen in the literature, from the case law and the legal statutes, that the declared aim of non-discrimination law is substantive equality. It is not just formal equality. It is really about actively dismantling inequality. It's about redistributing resources. It's making sure that everybody gets an equal share to social goods. It's not just about economic disadvantage, it's also about cultural and political and social rights. It's about promoting diversity, social inclusion, making sure that people are part of the community. It's about solidarity. So it's actually an active duty to establish equality across groups in a society. So roughly, to think about it, you can see it as a race, if you will. Formal equality would, for example, assume that men and women just race against each other, and whoever wins is the winner, gets the job, whatever it might be. Formal equality assumes there are no differences between men and women, and they don't take into consideration that physical strength might be different between the sexes. Substantive equality acknowledges that and says that on average, there might be a physical strength difference between those sexes. And therefore, we try to countervene that. We can do that in a more extreme way by equality of results, for example, affirmative action, by saying, I want a certain percentage of women to win that race. A more subtle way is equal opportunity, where you don't care about the outcome so much, but you're trying to change the process. So you would, for example, move women a little bit ahead in the race to account for physical differences here. But that is a more formal approach. The actual underlying idea of substantive equality is that you start to question whether the criteria that you're using to measure merit are actually good proxies for competence, because you could say that physical strength will always favor men and actually has a very biased history. And actually, physical strength is not necessarily the best way to measure competence. And therefore, you look out for different ways of measuring merit. And you come to the conclusion, maybe it would be better if they were playing chess against each other. So that is the idea of substantive equality. It's not about affirmative action giving a leg up. It's trying to question whether the criteria that we're using are actually measuring merit, and trying to figure out whether those criteria inherit past biases of certain groups, and trying to make sure that we actually level the playing field and get the best people. It's about uncovering hidden talent. That is exactly what substantive equality wants to do. Again, law, in a short, wants to fix society. So let's look at what fairness in computer science looks like. I would assume it comes as no surprise that people in tech try mainly to fix tech, and therefore most what comes up there is a tech solution, obviously. What we have done is trying to figure out how they actually approach this. So roughly, what happens in computer science is that they rely on a concept which is called conditional independence. That means you're trying to make sure when you employ a decision-making system that the target variable that you want to predict is independent from protected attributes and some other conditioning attributes. So what does that mean? If I want to give somebody a loan, which is my target variable, I want to make sure that this prediction is independent from race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and an additional conditioning attribute, for example, salary. So this is how it's being done. Usually it runs in a very similar way for all types of decision-making processes. What you do in order to figure out if somebody should get a loan is you're asking yourself, have prior candidates repaired loans that look similar to the applicant that is now applying for a loan? And based on this distinction, based on conditional independence, we have come up with a classification system of bias metrics that currently exist. There are bias metrics that we have coined are bias preserving, and there are bias metrics that are bias transforming metrics. Our distinction focuses on the fact that bias preserving fairness metrics try to evaluate if a decision is fair by matching error rates across groups. What does that mean? You are tasked to figure out whether the false positives and the false negatives are being made at the same rate in the past and now. So in other words, you're trying to preserve error rates. You're trying to make sure that you're not making things worse than they have been in the past, therefore bias preserving. The other category that we came up with is bias transforming. Those are all other tests that are out there. The key difference between bias transforming metrics is that this test is satisfied when the decision rates, so the outcomes, are matched, are equal across groups. Whereas the other one, bias preserving, is only satisfied if the error rates are matched. So decision rates versus error rates. So let's go back to bias preserving fairness metrics. At first glance, it actually looks quite fair, doesn't it? Because you look at past loan decisions and you ask yourself the question, has a person that looks similar to the current applicant repaired a loan, right? You do this for all kinds of decisions. For example, when you're admitting for university, you look at the current student that's applying, looking at a past similar student, asked, did they do well in law school, for example? You do the same with job applicants. If past applicants look like current applicants and they did well in their career, then you're gonna give them a shot. If people who look similar, like past applicants of health insurance, in fact, did not get sick, then you give health insurance to them. So you look at the past because you assume that there's some ground truth about it. You're trying to look at the past, trying to make assumptions about the future. You're justifying the future by using the past. You're trying to use the status quo as a neutral starting point to make decisions. The problem is the status quo is not at all neutral. And I think I cannot stress this enough. I want to just give two examples here because of time constraints. In the paper, we make much more examples. So I invite you to have a look at that. Let's talk about grades. Let's talk about what role grades play in our society. I think everybody will agree that, that when you're marking somebody, that there is an element of subjectivity to it. So obviously bias can creep into that. But what about math grades, for example? You could say there's some ground truth. 2 and 2 is 4. There's not much room for interpretation. So you could say, if I'm using math grades to decide if somebody should get a job or a fellowship, be admitted to grad school, whatever it might be, I have some ground truth. I have a good metric to measure merit, and therefore it's fine to use that. Yeah, well, you might be interested to hear that in 2015, interesting study showed that teachers in middle and high school assess the mathematical abilities of boys more favorably than girls, even though they're just as good or even more capable than the boys in the class. That leads